Good evening. Welcome to part one in our new series, Everything You Ever Wanted to Know About Dying and Death. I'm not sure I can tell you absolutely everything, but I'm certainly going to tell you most things that maybe you have wondered about dying and death. And in this first lesson particularly, we're going to focus on a subject that affects all of us at some time or another. Most of us have known someone currently experiencing pain because they are going through a terminal illness. And they likely are going to die, and that's the kind of pain that's really hard to cope with, but it's the kind of pain that just about every one of us will face at some time or another during life. And so we're going to talk in this first lesson about how to help someone who is grieving or how to help someone who is facing death. In the second lesson, we're going to talk about how to help yourself. But we're going to talk mostly in this lesson about how to help someone else. And I want to use King David as an example because David had an infant who was dying. The child was the illegitimate child of his relationship, you remember, with Bathsheba. And the child was going to die as a part of the punishment from God. And 2 Samuel chapter 12, beginning in verse 16, says David begged God to spare the child. And he went without food and lay on the ground all night. And the elders of his household pleaded with him to get up and eat with them, but he refused. And then on the seventh day, the child died. And David's advisors were afraid to tell him. He wouldn't listen to reason when the child was ill. They said, what drastic thing will he do when we have to tell him that the child is dead? And when David saw them whispering, he realized what had happened. And he said, is the child dead? And they said, yes, he is dead. And the Bible then says David got up from the ground, washed himself, put on lotions, and changed his clothes, and went to the tabernacle and worshiped the Lord. And his advisors were amazed. They were stunned. He then went back to the palace and ate dinner. And they said, we don't understand you. While the child was still living, you wept and refused to eat. But now that the child is dead, you have stopped your mourning and your grieving, and you're eating again. And David said, I fasted and wept while the child was alive, for I said, perhaps the Lord will be gracious to me and let the child live. But why should I fast when he is dead? Can I bring him back again? I will go to him one day, but he cannot return to me. If you have a loved one or a friend who was a Christian and has died, you can't bring them back, but you can go to them. And I want to use David's experience here in his grief as a launching point to talk to you about how to cope with the experience of a terminally ill family member or friend. Let's be honest. Sometimes as family members, we feel a little bit guilty because we think maybe we're not grieving or we're not weeping the way other people think we ought to be doing. And it's not because we're not going through that period of anticipatory grief. It's just that we've already been involved in it for several weeks or maybe months or sometimes cases several years before the death. And when the death occurs, there's actually a little sense of relief and release. I've known many instances like this where someone has had a family member or a friend that's been a long illness and they appear to be handling their grief very well after they have died. But really what has happened is they've gone through grief for weeks or months or years. Now, I know there's some of you who have gone through this. There's some of you who are going to go through this. And there's some of you that have never gone through this. But you will go through it someday. And let me tell you, this is one of those messages that if you don't need it today, write it down because you will need it sometime, and perhaps you know somebody who will need it. In fact, that's the main reason I'm doing this short series on everything you wanted to know about dying and death, because I want to be able to leave it on our YouTube channel for people when they need it in the future, and they will need it. The first thing that I want to suggest to you when you're helping someone who is grieving is anticipate their feelings. Anticipatory grief occurs when you know a loved one has an illness that could cause death and you begin the grieving process before the fact, and you go through a series of stages where death is the climax or the culmination of a process. Some of the stages are the same before and after, but anticipatory grief is totally different than what we call bereavement or grief after death. These are stages you simply must go through when a terminal illness is involved. And I have watched and helped people go through these hundreds of times, so I'm very familiar with it. In 1966, Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross conducted a now famous study at the University of Chicago Medical School where they interviewed 500 terminally ill patients, asking them, how are you feeling? What emotions are you experiencing? What are you going through? And she wrote a fantastic book and a very famous book called On Death and Dying that has basically been the textbook for America's dying for the last half century. And one of the things that came out of the textbook was dying in a hospital or dying with a terminal illness is a fairly recent phenomenon. I don't know if you realize that, because it's only been in the past 3 or 4 generations at the most that medical science has become precise enough to predict with any certainty when a person was going to die. In previous generations, people just died. They might not know they were going to die. They might have gotten sick for a little while. There wasn't a whole lot of treatment. Very few of them died in a hospital or in a long-term care facility. They usually died at home. So it's just during these last 2 or 3 generations that we've been able to study death very well. And Dr. Ross was able to define it through 5 primary stages. It's called the Kubler-Ross model. And the first stage is the shock and denial stage. When a person learns they have a terminal illness, they have cancer, something that is likely going to take their life, the first reaction is shock and denial. You can't be saying that I have cancer. That can't possibly be so. Dear God, no, that can't possibly be true. To start with, they don't even want to talk about it. They don't even use the word cancer or malignancy. They usually refer to it. So they have a hard time even talking about it because of their shock and denial. You see, shock is God's shock absorber that allows us to ease the pain just a little bit in the beginning. Dr. Ross said the emotional shock absorber that allows us to pretend we did not hear that which we cannot emotionally accept is called shock. And so we say, I can't believe it. I won't believe it. And a dying person goes through the stages, but also the caregiver for the dying person goes through the same stages. And you may not be going through the same stages at the same time, and particularly this is true when it's a husband or a wife or a parent and a child. Chances are you're not going through the same stages at the same time. And you could still be stuck in denial. I've seen this many times while somebody else has already gotten to the end and accepted it. People, in other words, do not walk through these stages like a pre-programmed robot. It's different for every person, and they stay in the stage a different amount of time. But usually shock and denial are first. Number 2 is anger. Just about everyone who has a terminal illness gets angry at one time or another. And you may be angry at the doctor for giving you the bad news. You may be angry at the hospital for the way you perceive they are treating you. You may be angry at the disease itself. You may be angry at some family member, or you may be angry at God. Even C.S. Lewis, perhaps the most brilliant Christian mind of the 20th century, got mad at God. When he wrote the book, A Grief Observed, it was about the death of his wife, Joy, whom he'd only been married to, and it was his first marriage, a few years, a late in life marriage. And there's a marvelous movie about it, one of the best movies and love stories you'll ever see, especially from a biblical perspective, called Shadowlands. But in the book, A Grief Observed, he described how he was angry at God. He said, in the midst of my pain, I asked, where is God? I go to him when my need is desperate, when all other help is vain, and what do I find? A door slammed in my face, and a sound of bolting and double bolting on the inside of the door, and after that, silence. And here was a man who knew God, who loved Jesus, who was one of the great, great theologians of the 20th century. But in the time of his intense grief, he said, I can't even find you, God. I wonder, how many of us would be honest enough to admit that when you're going through the experience of the death of a loved one, or perhaps are fighting an illness yourself, that there was this time when you looked up and said, God, why? Where are you, God? Why are you letting this happen to me? It's very natural and very normal to express anger at times like that. I know personally, I got very angry at my dad when he was dying of cancer in the 1980s. He was, for a while, the longest living lung cancer patient in the state of Tennessee. 14 years. He had undergone multiple surgeries, but he died because he smoked cigarettes all of his life. And that's why he died of cancer. And I was mad at him. It wasn't God just picking on him. He smoked cigarettes, and that was one of the consequences of smoking all your life. And so I was mad at my father more than I was mad at God. I thank God that I can remember my father now and remember him healthy before he got sick as a man who loved the Lord and loved us, loved his family. But I was angry for part of that time. Anger was a part of the way I dealt with my grief. The next stage, Dr. Kubler-Ross says, is bargaining. This is where you reach the stage and you say, okay, God, I don't want to be angry at you anymore. I don't want to be angry at my family anymore. I don't want to be angry at the doctors anymore. But I know it's dangerous to be angry at you, so let me make a deal with you, God. If you just miraculously will heal me, I will do and fill in the blank. That's awfully common among people who are facing some sort of terminal illness, bargaining with God. You know, it's actually very significant to look and see when terminally ill patients often die. It's almost uncanny. Most of them live through some significant calendar event. Maybe they'll say in their mind or say to other people, I want to make sure I make it through Christmas with my family. And they do, and then they die. Many of them want to live past a birthday or an anniversary, and they'll say, that is my goal, I want to live that long. And they do, and then they die. I want to live through a grandchild's graduation, and they do, and then they die. It's almost like they say, God, just let me live past this or that date. That's a very common stage, bargaining for the person who is dying and also for the caregiver, which we'll talk a little bit more about next week. Stage 4 is depression. Depression is often suppressed anger that is turned inward. What causes depression? Well, when we experience loss, it causes depression, and there is no time of loss that is greater than death or impending death. When you lose your spouse in divorce, you can become depressed because of that loss. Or when you move to another city, you lose your friends and leave them behind, and that can cause depression. When you lose a job, that can cause depression. But when people go through these experiences of terminal illness, they're often depressed because they lose their hair, they lose their job, they lose their income, they lose their mobility, they lose their freedom, they lose their independence, and then inevitably they know they're going to lose their life. That's a lot of loss. When you're dealing with the loss of a job or the loss of an income or the loss of friends in a move, you know, you'll make new friends, you'll get a new job, you'll get more income. This kind of loss is different. And so despondency and depression is a very common stage that people in grief go through. Stage 5 then, it's the final stage, and Dr. Kubler-Ross called it acceptance. And it's when you finally accept the reality that unless God supernaturally intervenes, the chances are your loved one or your friend is going to die. That doesn't mean you give up hope. That doesn't mean you stop praying. It just means you realized that and accepted the fact. And when you reach that level of acceptance, that's when you can begin to communicate with that person about things that really matter. You're no longer denying it. All the cards are on the table. The agenda is clear. You're no longer bargaining about it. You're no longer severely depressed about it. You're able to talk about it. And that's when you need to talk about the things that really matter. As we go through the series, we'll talk specifically about some of those things like wills and trust and the funeral and burial or cremation. There's a lot of things you need to talk about. But that's the point where you can begin to talk about that in a calm and rational way. If you stay in denial or you stay in anger, you never get there and never have those discussions, and it makes it much harder on the family or the friends of the dying one after the death. It's a sad experience, and I've seen it many, many times as a preacher, that Christian couples, when one of them is dying and has an illness and they know it, and right up to the end, both of them live in denial and never have talked about it, never addressed it, never accepted it, never planned for it financially, emotionally, spiritually. They've never planned out the service. They've never talked about any of that. There are some things that need to be said, but because they don't reach the level of acceptance, they don't get to say it. Reach stage 5, and then you can do the second thing, which is address their fears. Now, terminally ill patients have special fears, and unless you reach the level of acceptance, you can't really address and alleviate those fears. Why are terminally ill people afraid? There are 4 primary reasons, and I want you to think seriously about this so that you can know how to help somebody who's going through grief. The first is pain and suffering. Pain is a real fear. Let's all face it, we're going to die. But if all of us had a choice of how we would die, we would all one night put on our pajamas, say goodbye to our family, hug everybody around the neck, kiss them, pray to God, get in the bed, pull up the covers, curl up our toes, go to sleep, and wake up in the arms of Jesus. That's what we would do. No pain. Just go off to sleep, happy, healthy, and ready to meet the Lord. We all would choose that way, but we all know that very, very rarely happens. And so a terminally ill patient really fears pain. And if you want to help them, you have to enter into their pain and address it. You need to be the one to say to them first, if you don't want to talk about this, that's fine. But I know you're hurting, and I know you're worried about pain and hurting, and I care, and I want you to know we are going to do everything we possibly can to keep the pain away. That can help. A second thing that they face is indignity and dehumanization. Dehumanization often takes place when someone is terminally ill. They fear losing their hair. They fear becoming a guinea pig in a hospital or for some sort of medical treatment. They fear being poked and prodded here and there. They fear losing their dignity in the hospital. Can they ever possibly make a hospital gown that works? They fear losing their freedom. They fear the indignity that comes with a certain kind of disease because some are embarrassing. There's something to be said for dying with dignity rather than being dehumanized. And that's what they fear. They also fear being a burden to others. I guess if you were to ask me, that would be my single biggest fear. And it may be the number one fear of most terminally ill patients. They feel guilty because other people may have to change their whole lifestyle on their account. They're having to miss work, they're having to spend time in the hospital with them, they're having to cater to their needs, they're having to make decisions about where the terminally ill loved one will go. Will they go to a care facility? Will they go home? Will they come to their home? What will they do? And they don't want to be a burden. Address that fear and let them know you are more important to me than money or a job. You are more important to me than anything else in the world. Address their fear and try to alleviate that. And then some just fear death itself. Now, I can say for me personally, I don't really fear death itself. The Bible says that Jesus has removed the fear of death, and I have a strong faith about that. And I don't fear death itself, and I fear the other three things. I do. A couple of times in my life when I had heart surgery, and then last year when I was undiagnosed with this severe pain that was radiating from my back, I really deeply feared pain and suffering, and I feared dehumanization, and I really feared that I might somehow become a burden to others. Not much death itself, but a lot of people do. Why do we fear death? It's because we've never experienced it before. There is the unknown about death that we've never experienced. And even though we know Jesus said, I'll walk through it with you, yea, though I walk through the valley of shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. We still haven't fully experienced it. So talk about those fears. Try to alleviate those fears. Now, how do we do that? How can we help the terminally ill address these specific fears? Be honest with them. I know some of you have faced this dilemma with family members. Do we tell them they have cancer? Do we tell them the doctor is not giving much hope? How do we act around them? How do we talk to them? Do we ask them to talk to us? What do we tell them? Put yourself in their situation. I would want to know, and I've told my family that. I would want to know. I don't want my family keeping the truth from me. Don't play games. I have planned out various things in my life as it relates to wills, living wills, and all those things. We'll talk about that in the coming week. And I have planned out what I want done and not done, and I would want to know. But be honest with them and let them be honest with you. And then support them with prayer and comforting words, but don't be too preachy. A lot of damage has been done by well-meaning Christians who come in and feel like they have to say something. And sometimes they have to preach to them or preach at them, and they give them verses to try to make some sort of spiritual lesson out of every experience, when what they really just need is your support, your prayers, and your love. People often ask me, what do you say to people when they're grieving? What do you say to people when you visit them in the home or the hospital and they're terminally ill? And I said, I usually say almost nothing. I listen. I let them talk. But I certainly don't try to say too much. Number 3, be present. Many people fear dying alone, and so they need your presence. And let me throw this in right here because this is so important, because I know many of you have had times where you have been in the hospital with a terminally ill person and maybe they've lost consciousness. This particularly happens at Hope Hospice, where they're trying to control pain and the person is in and out of consciousness and then reaches a point where they are mostly out of consciousness. Be very careful how you talk about them. I've been in some rooms where people talk about them like a third person, like an inanimate object. Don't do that. When you talk to a loved one who is dying, don't talk to them like an object that's not there. Just talk to them and be with them. One of the reasons I say that is because we know hearing is the last sense to go. And so sometimes even when they appear to be unconscious, they can still hear. So just be present with them. And this may sound weird, but the last thing I want to say is don't lose hope. Now I know what some of you are saying. You're saying, didn't you just say that we have to accept the fact that they're dying? and you've given up hope. No, that's not what I meant to say at all. And if you interpret it that way, I didn't share it correctly. Christians are the only people who have hope at that moment. 1 Thessalonians 4:13 says, "Dear brothers and sisters, we want you to know what will happen to the believers who have died, so you will not grieve like people who have no hope." The only hope we have is Jesus. And so don't lose hope. There's always hope that a person may hang on longer than you think anyway, and hang on productively. I could go through example after example just in my 36 years of ministry here of people that we were told were going to die very early on, and they lived for months or years, and some of them fairly productively. So don't lose hope, generally speaking, but particularly don't lose hope, Christianly speaking, because we, of all people, are the people who should have hope. And as I say that and was preparing this message, I couldn't help but think of our good friend who died last year, Jerry Tallman. Jerry Tallman was a wonderful preacher. He was a wonderful soul winner, evangelist, and person, and artist, and father, and husband, and all those sorts of things. But when he found out a year or two ago that he had terminal cancer, he reached the acceptance stage, I think, quicker than anybody I've ever seen. We had several long discussions about his illness and his situation, and he could talk about the illness, and he could talk about heaven, and he could talk about Jesus, and what he would usually say to me is, "I'm going to go up there and check it all out. I'm going to go up there, and I'm going to get there before you do, and I'm going to find out what it's all like." And he said, "I'm glad I'm going to beat you there." That kind of faith and that kind of hope, anybody can relate to. So the good news I have for you today is that for a Christian, there is hope beyond the grave. Never give up that hope. Well, next week in our lesson, we're going to talk about how to help yourself go through grief. Tonight, we focused mostly on how to help someone you love or a friend go through grief. Next week, we're going to make it more personal, and we're going to talk about you. How to help yourself when you're personally sick or when you're personally having to help someone else. How to deal with your own grief. God bless you.